The day a legend returned, nobody noticed the legend. They only noticed the punishment. The war drums echoed across the steel plaza of the flagship Dominion's Wrath. Thousands of armored soldiers stood in perfect formation beneath a sky the color of burning copper. Dropships drifted overhead. Banners snapped in the cold wind. Every eye faced the elevated command platform at the center of the massive military gathering. Warlord Valara Thorn stood at the edge of the platform, silver skin gleaming beneath rows of floodlights. Her white ceremonial armor reflected the crimson glow of the setting sun. She looked exactly like the conqueror the galaxy believed her to be. Young, brilliant, unquestioned. Beside her stood Jackson Kane, motionless, silent. His dark security uniform carried no medals, no honors, no symbols of rank. To the thousands watching below, he was nothing more than another human bodyguard assigned to stand near someone important. A disposable man in a universe built around powerful people. The military tribunal officer stepped forward and activated a holographic display. Blue text shimmered above the platform. Violation of direct command protocol, the officer announced. His amplified voice rolled across the plaza. Failure to execute an immediate compliance order during a combat readiness inspection. A murmur spread through the gathered soldiers. Valyra's expression never changed. The sentence stands, she said calmly. The crowd immediately fell silent. Jackson remained still. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon beyond the fleet, beyond the banners, beyond the ceremony itself, as though none of it mattered. The officer hesitated briefly before carrying out the disciplinary order. The act itself lasted only seconds. Symbolic, public, designed to remind everyone that rank mattered. Authority mattered. Obedience mattered. Most soldiers lowered their eyes afterward, not because the punishment was severe, because humiliation carried its own weight. Yet Jackson did not react. He did not protest. He did not defend himself. He did not even look angry. He simply adjusted his posture and returned to attention. The silence that followed felt strange. Wrong somehow. Valyra studied him carefully. She had expected resentment. Pride. Something. Instead, she found nothing. Just discipline so complete it felt unnatural. Do you have anything to say for yourself? She asked. Her voice carried across the plaza. Thousands listened. Jackson finally looked at her. His face revealed almost nothing. No, Warlord. A faint frown touched her features. You disagree with the judgment? The judgment is yours to make. That was not my question. Jackson held her gaze. Then my answer remains the same. The crowd shifted uneasily. Nobody spoke to Valyra that way. Not because his words were disrespectful. Because they contained no fear. For the first time, something about the human irritated her. Not defiance. Absence. It was as if he stood outside the emotional gravity of the moment. The tribunal concluded. Soldiers began dispersing across the plaza. Engines roared overhead. Officers exchanged quiet conversations. Life moved on. But near the rear ranks, one elderly admiral had not moved at all. Admiral Corvinhale stared at Jackson Kane as if he had seen a ghost. His weathered face had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly. Around him, younger officers continued walking without noticing. Then Jackson turned briefly toward the departing crowd. A gust of wind shifted the collar of his uniform. For only a second, a faded scar became visible near the base of his neck. The old admiral froze. His breathing stopped. The color vanished completely from his face. Because he recognized that scar. He recognized the name. And suddenly, standing in the middle of a military ceremony, Admiral Corvinhale realized that Warlord Valyra Thorn had just publicly humiliated the last man in the galaxy she should ever have underestimated. The flagship never slept. Even deep into the artificial night cycle, the Dominion's wrath vibrated with the pulse of a living military machine. Engines thrummed beneath armored decks. Navigation systems whispered through hidden conduits. Thousands of personnel moved through corridors illuminated by cold white lights. Orders traveled. Reports accumulated. Fleets prepared for wars that had not happened yet. Jackson Kane returned to his duties as though nothing unusual had occurred. At 0600 hours, he reported to the command deck. At 0800 hours, he completed a security sweep of the Warlord's private chambers. At noon, he reviewed escort routes for an upcoming diplomatic gathering. The public punishment from the previous day might as well have never happened. At least from his perspective. Others were not so unaffected. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Junior officers exchanged glances. Security personnel watched him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Nobody understood why he remained so calm. Most soldiers carried their pride openly. Jackson carried nothing at all. By late afternoon, he stood alone outside Observation Gallery 3. Beyond the reinforced glass stretched an ocean of stars. Entire nebulae glowed in distant clouds of blue and violet light. Cargo ships drifted below like tiny sparks against the darkness. Jackson watched silently. One hand rested behind his back. The other held a maintenance report he had not yet read. Footsteps approached. He did not turn around. "You should be angry." The voice belonged to Warlord Veilira. Jackson continued looking toward the stars. "About what?" She stopped beside him. Silver armor reflected the faint glow of the galaxy beyond the glass. Most people would not ask that question. Most people are not standing here. Veilira folded her arms. The answer irritated her immediately, not because it was disrespectful, because it was impossible to argue with. She studied him carefully. Human, 38 years old, security specialist, exceptional service record. Nothing remarkable, nothing extraordinary. Yet every conversation with him felt strangely unbalanced. "Do you always speak in riddles?" she asked. Jackson finally glanced toward her. "No." "Then explain something." "I can try." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why did you not defend yourself yesterday?" The question lingered between them. Beyond the glass, a distant cruiser rotated slowly as maintenance drones moved across its hull. Jackson returned his attention to the stars. "You gave an order. And you outrank me." Veilira frowned. "That is all." It was enough. Silence followed. The answer felt incomplete. She could sense it. Yet something told her pushing harder would accomplish nothing. Jackson Kane had perfected the art of revealing almost nothing while technically answering every question. "You know what people are saying," she said eventually. "People always say something. They believe you should have challenged the decision." Jackson's expression never changed. People enjoy believing things. For reasons she could not explain, that answer frustrated her even more. Before she could continue, another voice interrupted from the corridor. "Warlord." Both turned. Admiral Corvin Hale stood near the entrance. His uniform appeared perfectly composed. His face did not. Since yesterday, he had barely slept. The old officer's eyes settled briefly on Jackson before immediately looking away. Veilira noticed. "Admiral." Hale cleared his throat. "The strategic briefing is prepared. I will be there shortly." The Admiral hesitated, just for a second. Then he looked directly at Jackson. The expression that crossed his face resembled neither pity nor contempt. It looked disturbingly close to fear. Genuine fear. Jackson nodded politely. Nothing more. Hale left immediately. Veilira watched him disappear down the corridor. Her instincts sharpened. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She looked back toward Jackson. "Do you know Admiral Hale?" "Not personally." "Then why does he look at you like that?" For the first time, something faint appeared in Jackson's eyes. Not amusement. Not sadness. Something older. A memory, perhaps. Then it vanished. "You would have to ask the Admiral." The answer sounded simple. Yet as Veilira watched the humans standing calmly beneath the stars, she found herself wondering why a veteran officer with 40 years of military service suddenly looked terrified every time he saw her bodyguard. Some names disappeared from history because they were forgotten. Others disappeared because entire governments agreed they should never be spoken again. Admiral Corvin Hale sat alone inside Archive Chamber 7. The room was buried deep beneath the command decks of the Dominion's Wrath, hidden behind security doors that most officers never knew existed. Rows of ancient data cores stretched into darkness. Dust floated through pale blue light. The fleet stored its oldest military records here. The dangerous ones. The embarrassing ones. The classified ones. Hale stood before an inactive terminal for nearly a minute before finally placing his authorization badge against the scanner. A warning appeared immediately. Restricted historical records. Access requires command authorization. He entered additional credentials. Another warning followed. Then another. Eventually the terminal accepted his request. The screen illuminated the tired lines on his face. His hands trembled slightly. Not from age. From memory. He typed a single name. Jackson Kane. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the archive froze. New security layers appeared. Old military seals filled the display. Hale stared at them in disbelief. Even now, even after all these years, the records remained locked behind protections reserved for the highest levels of military authority. The old admiral swallowed hard. "What were you involved in?" he whispered. The terminal finally opened. Thousands of files flooded the screen. Battle reports, strategic analyses, fleet movements, casualty records, entire campaigns hidden from public history. Hale scrolled rapidly. His breathing grew shallower with every page. Outside the archive chamber, life aboard the flagship continued normally. Officers attended meetings. Pilots reviewed schedules. Mechanics serviced fighters. None of them knew what Hale was discovering. None of them knew why the sight of a faded scar had nearly stopped his heart. Several decks above, Warlord Veilira sat through a strategic briefing she barely heard. Charts moved across holographic displays. Sector governors argued over trade routes. Fleet commanders debated logistics. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the human bodyguard standing outside the chamber doors. Jackson Kane. He never complained, never defended himself, never reacted the way people expected. The more she considered it, the stranger it became. Most people wanted something. Promotion, recognition, revenge, respect. Jackson seemed interested in none of them. That unsettled her. A quiet chime interrupted the meeting. One of her aides approached. "Warlord." She glanced up. "What is it?" The aide hesitated. "Admiral Hale has requested immediate private audience." Veilira frowned. Hale never interrupted briefings without reason. "Send him." Minutes later, the old admiral entered her private conference room. His face looked worse than before. Pale, distracted, troubled. He placed a data crystal onto the table between them. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Veilira leaned forward. "What happened?" Hale looked directly into her eyes. "I found the name." Something in his voice caused the room to feel colder. "What name?" The admiral exhaled slowly. "The one nobody has spoken in 15 years. Veilira remained silent. Hale glanced toward the sealed doorway as though afraid someone might overhear. Then he lowered his voice. "Jackson Kane is not a former security specialist." He paused. That identity was created afterward. For the first time, genuine confusion crossed Veilira's face. "After what?" The admiral looked down at the data crystal resting on the table. The expression in his eyes resembled a man standing at the edge of an old nightmare. "After the war that changed half the galaxy." Silence settled across the room. Heavy, uncomfortable. Outside the viewport, stars drifted past in endless darkness. Somewhere aboard the massive flagship, Jackson Kane continued his ordinary duties, completely unaware that a sealed chapter of galactic history had just begun opening itself once again. Rumors traveled faster than starships. They moved through mess halls, maintenance bays, flight decks, and officer lounges with a speed no communication network could match. By the next morning, whispers had spread across nearly every section of the Dominion's wrath. Nobody knew the full story. That only made the rumors stronger. A navigation officer claimed Jackson Kane had once commanded an entire sector fleet. A fighter pilot insisted he had personally ended a war that lasted 9 years. Engineers argued that the stories were impossible. Intelligence personnel stopped arguing altogether. They simply listened. Jackson remained unaware of most of it. Or perhaps he noticed and chose not to care. At 0600 hours, he completed his security inspection. At 0800 hours, he reviewed diplomatic arrival schedules. At 10:30, he helped a maintenance crew move damaged sensor equipment because they were shorthanded. Nothing about his behavior changed. Nothing about him matched the growing mythology surrounding his name. That contradiction fascinated people. Warlord Veilira found herself noticing it as well. Standing outside the command bridge, she watched Jackson assisting technicians with a cargo container nearly everyone else ignored. No audience, no recognition, no strategic advantage, just a task that needed doing. The more she learned about him, the less sense he made. Later that afternoon, she entered a restricted conference room where Admiral Hale waited beside a holographic projector. The old officer looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. Dozens of archived files floated around him in translucent blue columns. Entire sections had been decrypted overnight. Veilira approached slowly. "What have you found?" Hale activated another document. The room filled with military records older than many governments. Casualty projections, Fleet deployments. Strategic evaluations. Names of commanders long since dead. Yet one name appeared repeatedly. Jackson Kane. Not occasionally. Constantly. The admiral looked disturbed every time it surfaced. The deeper I search, the stranger it becomes, he said quietly. Every major archive references him. Every strategic review mentions him. Yet public records show almost nothing. Veolyra studied the projections. That should not be possible. It should not. Hale opened another file. This one contained testimony from senior commanders. Entire paragraphs had been blacked out. Several sections remained inaccessible even now. One sentence survived. The admiral enlarged it. Veolyra read silently. If Kane enters the theater, all previous predictions become unreliable. The room fell quiet. Predictions? She asked. Hale nodded slowly. Military outcomes. Veolyra looked up. One man changed strategic forecasts for entire wars. The old admiral did not answer immediately. His silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, several decks away, Jackson stood alone in Observation Gallery 3 once again. Beyond the glass, stars drifted across endless darkness. A young lieutenant approached nervously. Sir. Jackson glanced over. Lieutenant. The officer hesitated. May I ask a question? You already did. The lieutenant almost smiled. Is it true? Jackson looked back toward the stars. Is what true? The young man swallowed. Were you really there? For the first time, uncertainty appeared in Jackson's expression. Not fear. Not regret. Something quieter. Much older. He stared into the darkness beyond the flagship for several long seconds. Then he answered softly. A lot of people were there. The lieutenant waited for more. Nothing came. Jackson returned his attention to the stars. Conversation finished. Yet as the young officer walked away, he carried the same feeling spreading throughout the fleet. The feeling that somewhere beneath the ordinary uniform of a silent bodyguard, an entire chapter of galactic history was slowly beginning to wake up. History rarely disappeared all at once. More often, it was buried beneath newer victories, newer governments, and people who preferred not to remember what had frightened them. Admiral Corvin Hale spent the next 12 hours descending deeper into classified archives than he had ever intended to go. Every new file revealed another fragment. Every fragment raised more questions. Entire military academies had once taught strategic doctrines named after Jackson King. Fleet simulations had been built around predicting his decisions. Intelligence agencies had maintained dedicated divisions tasked with studying his campaigns. Then, almost overnight, the records ended. Not because he died. Not because he lost. Because he vanished. Hale sat alone in the archive chamber as another document unfolded across the holographic display. This one originated 15 years earlier. A strategic review signed by 6 admirals and 3 heads of state. Most of the report remained restricted, but one sentence survived. If Commander Kane accepts operational control, probability models become statistically unreliable. The old admiral leaned back slowly. He had served for 4 decades. He had met heroes, politicians, conquerors, and legends. He had never seen language like that attached to a single person. Meanwhile, aboard the Dominion's Wrath, rumors continued spreading. What began as whispers among officers had become conversations across entire decks. Mechanics discussed Jackson during maintenance shifts. Pilots exchanged theories in flight lounges. Security personnel quietly reviewed old personnel files searching for answers. Nobody found many. The absence of information became its own mystery. Warlord Veolyra noticed the change immediately. The moment Jackson entered a room, conversations shifted. Not stopped. Shifted. People watched him differently now. Not with sympathy after the public punishment. With curiosity. Respect. In some cases, caution. That disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Late that evening, she summoned him to her private strategy chamber. The room overlooked a sea of stars stretching endlessly beyond reinforced crystal windows. Holographic fleet formations drifted above a circular command table. Jackson entered precisely on time. As always. You requested my presence, Warlord? Veolyra studied him for a moment. Dark uniform. Calm posture. No sign whatsoever that half the flagship had become obsessed with his past. Sit down. Jackson sat. Do you know what people are saying about you? She asked. Probably several different things. None of which you find concerning? He considered that. People need hobbies. Veilira almost smiled despite herself. Almost. You enjoy avoiding questions. Sometimes. She folded her arms. Then let me ask a direct one. Jackson nodded. All right. Her eyes locked onto his. Who were you before becoming a bodyguard? Silence settled across the chamber. Beyond the windows, distant stars glimmered against the darkness. Jackson looked toward them for several seconds. Long enough for the silence to become noticeable. Then he answered. Someone else. Veilira exhaled sharply. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. For the first time, frustration touched her expression openly. Not because he refused to speak. Because he sounded sincere. As if the answer genuinely meant something to him. Before she could continue, the chamber doors opened unexpectedly. Admiral Hale entered carrying a data crystal. The old officer looked as though he had seen something that fundamentally altered his understanding of the galaxy. He stopped near the table. His eyes moved briefly toward Jackson, then back to Veilira. Warlord, he said quietly. I found the campaign. Veilira frowned. Which campaign? Hale swallowed. The one they removed from every public history record. The room became still. Even Jackson's attention shifted toward the Admiral. For the first time since this mystery began, something unreadable flickered behind the human's eyes. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. And suddenly Veilira realized they were no longer searching for an old story. They were standing at the edge of one. The data crystal rested in the center of the strategy table like a small piece of gravity. Nobody touched it for several seconds. The stars beyond the observation windows drifted silently across the darkness while the flagship continued its endless journey through deep space. Admiral Hale finally activated the crystal. A holographic battlefield appeared above the table. Ancient fleet markers illuminated the room in pale blue light. Hundreds of ships, dozens of worlds. Entire sectors burning beneath strategic overlays from a war long absent from public memory. Veilira stared at the projection. She had studied military history her entire life. She did not recognize any of it. This campaign was erased, Hale said quietly. Not classified. Erased. More images appeared. Fleet reports. Command summaries. Emergency communications. Entire governments struggling against a conflict that seemed impossibly large. The old admiral enlarged a single section. A human insignia appeared. Beneath it rested a familiar name. Jackson Kane. Veilira felt her pulse quicken. What was his role? Hale looked at her. Then back at the projection. Officially, he paused. Senior Operational Commander. Another file opened automatically. This one carried recommendations from Allied military leaders. Most of the text remained damaged or restricted, but one line survived. Request immediate transfer of Commander Kane to primary theater. Strategic collapse probability reduced by 63%. Silence settled across the chamber. Veilira read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Across the room, Jackson remained standing near the window. His expression never changed. You knew this was here, she said. Jackson looked toward the projection. Parts of it. Parts. He nodded once. History belongs to historians. Hale almost laughed. The sound held no humor. History belongs to survivors. More documents appeared. Strategic maps shifted rapidly through years of conflict. Every major turning point carried the same pattern. The same name. The same commander. The same impossible outcomes. Veilira folded her arms. Why erase it? Neither man answered immediately. Eventually Hale spoke. Because some victories become inconvenient. The room grew quiet again. Veilira studied Jackson carefully. The ordinary bodyguard uniform suddenly looked strange. Incomplete. As though it belonged to someone else. All of this happened, she said slowly. And you became a security officer? Jackson considered the question. The war ended. That is not an explanation. It is the only one that matters. For the first time, frustration vanished from Veilira's expression. In its place came something unfamiliar. Understanding. Not complete understanding. The beginning of it. She realized he genuinely wanted none of this. Not the recognition. Not the stories. Not the reputation. While the rest of the galaxy spent years chasing importance, Jackson Kane had spent 15 years avoiding it. The realization unsettled her more than any military record. A warning tone suddenly interrupted the silence. The central display changed. Fleet Command Priority Notification. Incoming transmission. Hale frowned and accepted the message. A tactical officer appeared instantly. His face looked pale. Admiral. Warlord. He swallowed. Long-range sensors have detected an unidentified task force entering regional space. The room shifted immediately. Professional instincts took over. New maps replaced historical records. Sensor contacts appeared along the outer edge of the display. Veolyra stepped closer. Strength assessment. Unknown. The officer hesitated. But their formation matches archived patterns from a prohibited military doctrine. Hale stared at the screen. His expression slowly changed. He recognized the pattern. So did Jackson. For the first time since the conversation began, the human bodyguard moved toward the command table. The room noticed. The old admiral noticed. Most of all, Veolyra noticed. Because for the first time since she had met him, Jackson Kane was no longer looking at the stars. He was looking at the battlefield. The command bridge transformed within seconds. Calm conversation vanished beneath a flood of tactical reports, sensor updates, and navigation projections. Holographic displays expanded across the chamber. Entire sections of space illuminated in red. Officers moved quickly between stations. The Dominion's Wrath was no longer a flagship traveling through routine territory. It had become the center of an unfolding crisis. Warlord Veolyra stood at the primary command platform, studying the incoming contacts. Dozens of unidentified vessels advanced through the outer edge of sensor range with disciplined precision. No broadcasts. No diplomatic signals. No visible intent. Just formation. Perfect formation. That alone was enough to trouble experienced commanders. Admiral Hale stared at the display. The pattern is identical. Veolyra glanced toward him. Identical to what? The old admiral swallowed. The opening deployment from the Forbidden Campaign. Silence settled over the nearest officers. Several recognized the reference immediately. Others simply noticed the fear in Hale's voice. Neither reaction inspired confidence. New sensor data appeared. Additional contacts emerged behind the first wave. Then more. The tactical display expanded again. Veolyra's expression hardened. That is not a reconnaissance force. No, Hale said quietly. It is not. Across the bridge, officers began proposing responses. Defensive screens. Interception routes. Long-range positioning adjustments. The suggestions arrived rapidly. None seemed adequate. Every new projection produced the same result. Rising uncertainty. Rising risk. Rising casualties. Veolyra listened carefully, then dismissed half the recommendations. Her instincts remained sharp. Her experience remained substantial. Yet for the first time since assuming command, she felt the battlefield resisting her understanding. The enemy formation made no obvious mistakes. No predictable weaknesses. No clear center of gravity. It felt like fighting a shadow. Near the rear of the command deck, Jackson Kane stood silently observing the display. He had not offered advice. Had not interrupted. Had not attempted to influence anyone. Yet several officers kept glancing toward him. Waiting. Watching. The rumors had reached them all. Another sensor officer suddenly spoke. Warlord. The unidentified fleet is accelerating. The red markers shifted immediately. Closing speed increased. Time available for decision-making decreased. The bridge grew quieter. Veolyra looked across the tactical display. She hated uncertainty. Hated incomplete information. Most of all, she hated realizing that every option in front of her carried consequences she could not fully predict. For the first time in years, doubt touched her confidence. It lasted only a moment. Yet Jackson noticed it. So did Admiral Hale. The old admiral slowly turned toward the human. You recognize this formation. It was not a question. Jackson studied the display for several seconds. Yes. Several officers stopped what they were doing. Veolyra looked directly at him. From the campaign? From the beginning of it. The answer sent another ripple through the bridge. Hale closed his eyes briefly, as though hearing confirmation made everything worse. Veolyra stepped down from the command platform. Then tell me what I am looking at. Jackson remained silent. The stars beyond the bridge windows reflected faintly across the glass. Red tactical markers drifted through the darkness like distant warning lights. Finally he spoke. You are looking at a commander who wants you focused on the wrong problem. The room became completely still. Veolyra frowned. Explain. Jackson's eyes remained on the display. Those ships are not the attack. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. Hale slowly lowered himself into a chair. He already knew what was coming. The old fear had returned to his eyes. Veolyra felt it immediately. Something had changed. Not on the battlefield. In the room itself. Because for the first time since she had met him, Jackson Kane was not speaking like a bodyguard. He was speaking like the man history had tried to erase. Nobody asked Jackson Kane to take command. That was the strange part. The request never came. No formal transfer of authority appeared on the command display. No officer surrendered rank. Yet as silence settled across the bridge, every eye drifted toward him anyway. The red tactical markers continued advancing across the holographic battlefield. Tom was running short. Jackson stepped closer to the display. For a moment, he simply studied it. The room watched. He did not rush. Did not perform. Did not act like a returning legend. He looked like a man examining a machine that had developed a familiar problem. Expand sensor range 30% beyond the primary contact line, he said. The nearest tactical officer hesitated, then obeyed instantly. New data flooded the display. Additional readings appeared far beyond the visible fleet. Small, scattered, easy to miss. Admiral Hale closed his eyes. There they are. Veolyra looked at him sharply. What am I seeing? Jackson answered before the Admiral could. The real operation. He pointed toward the scattered signatures. The visible fleet exists to occupy your attention. Those vessels are positioning around your logistics corridors. Several officers rapidly recalculated projections. Their expressions changed almost immediately. Supply routes, communications relays, navigation beacons. Every vulnerable support network behind the fleet suddenly appeared exposed. The enemy was not targeting the warship. They were targeting everything that allowed the warship to function. Veolyra stared at the display. That would isolate the entire sector. Yes. Jackson folded his arms. Which is why they expect you to commit your main force toward the obvious threat. The bridge grew quiet again. Not confused this time. Focused. One by one, officers began recognizing the pattern. The enemy formation that had seemed perfect moments earlier now revealed its purpose. A distraction. A carefully constructed illusion. Veolyra felt a strange sensation she had never experienced before. She was learning. Not from a lecture. Not from a military academy. From watching someone see a battlefield differently than everyone else. What would you do? She asked. Jackson remained silent for several seconds. Then he pointed toward a cluster of distant stars near the edge of the display. Nothing there matters. Several officers looked confused. One commander frowned. Those sectors contain no strategic assets. Jackson nodded. Exactly. Understanding struck Hale immediately. The old admiral actually smiled. You would retreat toward empty space. I would relocate the fleet where their assumptions stopped working. Officers began exchanging startled looks. New simulations appeared. Every model produced the same surprising outcome. Enemy projections destabilized. Ambush routes collapsed. Supply attacks lost effectiveness. The battlefield transformed. Not through superior firepower. Through perspective. Veolyra watched the data recalculate in real time. For the first time since the crisis began, probability estimates improved instead of deteriorating. The bridge atmosphere changed with them. Confidence returned. Hope returned. Yet something else returned as well. Recognition. The younger officers might not fully understand what they were witnessing. The veterans did. One by one, senior commanders slowly rose from their stations. Not because protocol required it. Not because anyone ordered them to. Because instinct took over. Old military habits buried beneath 15 years of silence. Jackson noticed. So did Veolyra. Across the bridge, experienced officers who outranked him by entire careers were standing the way soldiers once stood when a legendary commander entered the room. Jackson looked genuinely uncomfortable. Sit down, he said. Nobody moved immediately. The moment lasted only seconds. Yet for Warlord Veolyra Thorn, it revealed more than every classified archive combined. The galaxy had not feared the stories. The galaxy had feared the man capable of making impossible situations suddenly look simple. 3 days later, the crisis was over. Not because the enemy disappeared. Not because a miraculous weapon changed the balance. The danger passed because the fleet stopped reacting exactly the way the enemy expected. Supply corridors remained secure. Communication relays stayed active. Strategic positions shifted before traps could close around them. One careful decision after another transformed a looming disaster into a manageable problem. By the end of the third day, the unidentified force withdrew beyond sensor range. The command bridge remained quiet long after the final reports arrived. Officers studied the updated tactical maps with expressions that bordered on disbelief. The numbers were clear. The projections were clear. The outcome was clear. Yet many of them still struggled to understand what they had witnessed. Jackson Kane returned to his normal duties almost immediately. He reviewed security schedules, conducted inspections, walked the same corridors he always had. The legend that had begun resurfacing seemed to interest everyone except the man at the center of it. Warlord Veilira found that impossible to ignore. Late that evening, she requested a private meeting in the same strategy chamber where the mystery had truly begun. The room stood silent beneath soft white lights. Stars drifted beyond the observation windows. Jackson arrived exactly on time. As always. You wanted to see me? Veilira looked at him for several seconds before answering. Yes. For once, she seemed uncertain how to begin. That alone felt unusual. Finally, she stepped toward the command table. I owe you an apology. Jackson blinked once. Genuine surprise. For what? The question almost made her laugh. You cannot be serious. He shrugged slightly. There are several possibilities. Veilira lowered her eyes briefly, then met his gaze again. I judged you before I understood who you were. Jackson remained silent. I saw a bodyguard. She exhaled slowly. I never bothered to see the man. The room fell quiet. No dramatic speech followed. No ceremonial declaration. Just honesty. Simple and unguarded. Jackson looked toward the stars beyond the window. Most people do that. Does it bother you? He considered the question. Not anymore. Veilira studied him carefully. The answer carried no bitterness. No resentment. Somehow that made it more powerful. The fleet respects you. The fleet respects old stories. You are part of those stories. Jackson smiled faintly. Only a small part. She shook her head. The archives disagree. The archives were written by people with too much free time. For the first time in days, both of them laughed. The tension vanished. Not completely. Just enough. Outside the window, stars continued their silent journey across the darkness. Veilira stepped closer to the glass. Do you ever regret leaving it behind? Jackson joined her near the observation deck. The command. The reputation. The legend. He watched the stars for a long moment before answering. Legends are heavy. And being forgotten is easier? Another pause. Then a quiet smile. Much easier. The answer stayed with her. She finally understood what the archives never could. Every classified report, every military record, every fearful rumor focused on what Jackson Kane had done. None of them explained who he was. The man himself was far simpler. He helped where he could, carried responsibility without demanding recognition, chose humility when fame remained available. The galaxy had spent 15 years remembering a legend. She had spent a few days meeting a human being. Somewhere beyond the flagship, stars burned across the endless dark. Empires would rise. Wars would be studied. Histories would be rewritten. Yet standing beside the window, Veilira realized the most important lesson had nothing to do with strategy. Power could force obedience. Rank could command attention. Reputation could inspire fear. But character required none of them. And as she watched the quiet human beside her staring out into the infinite night, she finally understood why entire fleets remembered the legend while the people who truly knew him respected the man.